I bet like many people, you too have wondered at some point, what would it be like to lose my head? Or rather, my body? Because your conscious mind's base of operations is right here. So from that perspective, it's more like a debodying rather than the beheading. Execution by beheading goes way back. The ancient Greeks and Romans already did it. It was probably done before then. Generally, losing one's head was reserved for nobility, a privilege for high status, if you will. Whereas commoners would be more likely to be strung up or otherwise made to expire in more brutal ways like the wheel or other pleasantries like that. But if you were sentenced to capital punishment back in history and somehow had the choice, what would be worse, being debodied by axe or sword? Let's look into it, shall we? But first, I'm going to take a sip of water because there is no sponsorship. Although you can sign up on Patreon if you like, link below. So I was looking for botched executions to see if there was some kind of trend, if either sword or axe is more likely to give you a more painful demise. And they're all from the 16th and 17th century. Not necessarily because there were more executions than, I mean, there might have been, but primarily because the later in history you go, the more sources there are that survive, and the more detailed they tend to be, so I'm attributing it to that. The first example on my list is Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who was executed in 1541 at the age of 67 by axe and low block. This is one of the two kinds that were used. The low block meant that the sentenced victim would be lying down. The high block would be taller and you would kneel and bend over to place your head on it. This does have practical implications. We'll get back to that in a moment. So unfortunately for her, the local executioner who normally did the job was away, so they brought in an inexperienced replacement who, according to the account, hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. And some sources specify it took as many as 11 strokes, which is horrible. Obviously, lack of experience is the main culprit here, but the low block might have also added to the difficulty due to the angle. If you swing downward with an axe and the target is that low, you might end up not hitting with the entire length of the edge, so only chop partially into the neck and then it takes multiple swings, but that can't be the entire reason here. Next is a well-known example, Mary Stuart, aka Mary Queen of Scots, executed in 1587, also by axe and chopping block. The sources disagree on this one. According to one account, the first swing hit the back of her head, and the second severed most of the neck except one strand of connective tissue, which the third then severed all the way. Another account said that the first one went through most of the neck except that little bit, and then the second took care of it all. So it may not have been actually botched, depends on which source you go by. Speaking of sources, they're linked in the description below. So, in the 17th century, there was an executioner who became infamous for botching his job with an axe. John Catch, also known as Jack Catch. He executed William Russell in 1683, who actually paid Catch beforehand to do a clean job. That was common at the time. You would sort of bribe the executioner to make it clean, which Catch didn't. The first swing hit him in the back of the, or in the side of the head. Then Russell allegedly looked up at him indignantly and complained about how inhumanely he was being treated despite the payment. There is some disagreement about the authenticity of the source, so that may or may not have happened. Either way, it's said to have taken several excruciating blows to end it. Shortly after, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was executed by the same man in 1685, unfortunately for him. He also gave him money for the same reason, and even told him, I know how you did Lord Russell dirty, don't do the same to me. Scott even asked to check the edge of the axe and then said it was too dull. Catch said, basically, oh, it's fine. The edge was so fine, it turned out, that he ended up hacking at him over and over, even threw down the axe to grab a knife and finish sawing the head off with that. The crowd was so furious they would have torn him apart if the guards hadn't saved him. There were rumors that enemies of Russell and Scott paid Catch more to prolong their suffering, and That seems plausible to me because Ketch was an executioner for 23 years. He had a bad reputation toward the end, but apparently only these 2 cases were mentioned as particularly brutal, at least when it comes to executions by axe. Strangulations by hanging could end up being excruciatingly slow, and again, depending on whether or not he was paid, he might do it quicker or more slowly. It seems like the guy wasn't completely incompetent. It couldn't have been, right? There would have been more cases and he would have probably not been executioner for that long. So it's quite possible that he was simply corrupt and, took the money to make it worse. In fact, double pocketed the money. Isn't that one of the worst cases of double dipping you can imagine? There are a few other cases like Arthur Elphinstone, Lord Balmerino in 1746, where the executioner took 3 blows, but they're not a whole lot of cases that I could find. There are just a few mentioned here and there where the execution was botched. So far, all axe. Let's take a look at how it goes with a sword. Queen Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was executed in 1536, and Henry brought in the hangman of Calais, sometimes referred to as swordsman, for an execution by sword, which was more common in continental Europe. It was done in England too, but the axe was usually preferred. The sword would have been seen as more honorable, and in this case it was also a particularly merciful decision because the alternative would have been burning. The way it happened is Anne was kneeling upright and the executioner took her head in one swing with the sword. Now Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was sentenced to death by axe, which would have been seen as cruder. I'm assuming it was over in one blow as well. At least I found nothing to the contrary mentioned anywhere. Now, Catherine is said to have asked for a chopping block to know how she should lay on it. And that's the saddest thing I've read in a long time, honestly. Just imagine a terrified young woman, only 19 years old, spending her last evening practicing how to put her head on an execution block. This is why I have a love-hate relationship with history. Yes, it's interesting, you can learn a lot from it, but it's also incredibly dark and tragic and depressing a lot of the time. Finally, I want to briefly talk about what you might consider the best case scenario. Joel F. Harrington, in his book The Faithful Executioner, describes the life of a German executioner named Franz Schmidt, born in 1554. The most common execution method he had to execute was hanging. The sword was rarely used, and his father taught him how to use it, made him practice on pumpkins, gourds, rhubarb stalks, and eventually various animals. Franz Schmidt was active in his occupation for a whole 45 years, and as you can imagine, became highly skilled during that time. He recorded 187 executions by sword during that time, and he noted 4 instances as botched, requiring more than 1 stroke. He was clearly very skilled. The question is, did he have a particularly high standard for his work, or was it generally considered to be botched if it took more than 1 swing? The author also mentions in the book that in some German towns, the executioner would risk getting killed by the crowd if he took more than 3 swings. So my guess is that the expectation was generally single blow. 2 was probably still okay. I'm guessing it was not considered botched at that point. Maybe it was. 3 may or may not have been seen as botched. More, definitely. Of course, not every executioner was as successful as Franz Schmidt. There was a shamefully botched execution in Nuremberg in 1641, where an inexperienced executioner hit wood with a sword and only sliced off a bit of scalp from a young woman's head. The crowd wanted to let her go after that, but then the executioner tried again and ended up hacking at her repeatedly, which made the people so angry they would have stoned him to death if the guards hadn't saved him. So what can we take away from all this? First off, it's important to keep an inherent bias in mind. What are people likely to talk about? The smooth execution that went off without a hitch in 1 swing, or the botched one that took several swings and was quite a spectacle and a horrible affair? It's obvious. You're much more likely to report on that, whereas a smooth execution that went in 1 swing, you just mentioned they were executed, period. Right? But even then, there aren't actually that many. There are not a whole lot of cases of horribly botched executions. Of the ones that are described, almost all were done with an axe. I'm assuming that more executions were done with an axe overall, but I don't know that for sure. The question is it the implement or the implementation? In other words, is it a skill issue? What I could imagine is that executioners probably respected the sword more. I mean, it cost more, and it had more prestige and symbolic power, right? So they may have been more serious about it and practiced more. Whereas it might have just been like, have you chopped wood before? Okay, here, get to it. Probably not quite like that, but I would assume that there was less emphasis on skill and practice, even though it was obviously needed as well. If nothing else, then just to hit precisely. You know, you don't want to end up with someone who keeps chopping into people's shoulders and backs and head. There were specialized executioner swords in Europe from the mid-1500s onward. They generally have a very broad blade, and the grind helps limit the resistance as it goes through the material. They were generally heavier than fighting swords, and the balance would be further away from the hilt. At that point, you still need to be good enough with it to not mess up the edge alignment. That's always a problem. But of course you can do that with an axe the same way. There were different kinds of executioner's axe, a lot of different shapes. Some had very long edges that would of course help. When it comes to the edge, there's clearly some concern about the axe being too dull, and I found one that has close-up pictures where the edge itself looks okay. The overall grind could definitely be better for the purpose, in my opinion. It's just basically a pretty steep secondary bevel at the end. It would be more effective if you tapered it more gradually and made it thinner overall. Yeah, it's more likely to be damaged, but it's definitely would do a cleaner job, I would think. But again, there aren't that many botched executions even with an axe, supposedly. I actually find it difficult to imagine how you could screw it up with a sharp axe and a chopping block. Like putting just about anything on a chopping block and having added with an axe, it's not that difficult, really. I mean, accuracy, sure, you want to hit in the right spot. Again, you don't want to hit the back or whatever, but yeah, it shouldn't be that difficult. It would be more difficult with a sword. Just imagine the executioner's aiming for the neck, but accidentally swings too low and just chops the arm off or whatever. Now, that would be spectacularly botched. I haven't found any case like that, but yeah, overall, I suppose if you had the choice, which of course they wouldn't have given you back then, but if you had the choice, I suppose sword might be a little safer overall, but it might not make that much of a difference. It really seems more of a skill issue. And of course, the damn thing needs to be sharp, both in the case of the axe and the sword. You could have it much, much worse either way. There are so many more cases of botched hangings. And of course, there's a much greater total number of hangings as well. So yeah, that can go horribly wrong. There were even people who survived it, who were strung up for 15 minutes, or in some cases longer, some cases half an hour or longer, and they actually ended up surviving it. We have to assume that the guillotine was invented because of not so clean cases, where it was more painful, it took more swings and all that. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have seen the need for that. Either way, whether it be axe or butcher's cleaver or sword or machete or who knows what, anything is better than torturous methods like the wheel or being drawn and quartered and all of that. History is full of incredibly sadistic, messed up ways of carrying out capital punishment. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Let me know what you think. Which one would you pick? Thanks for watching.